My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this is the final part, or final set, I guess, of videos on the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy. But this is part one of subtle changes that Peter Jackson made that you wouldn't really catch unless you were a really big fan of the book. And there's some interesting ones in this category. Some of them are maybe slightly stretchy, kind of like my details that he got right videos, because some of these you don't have to be a huge fan of the book to really catch. If you've read the book at all, you probably would notice some of these, but they are interesting changes at least, and some of them you at least have to have actually read parts of the book that maybe you wouldn't normally have read if you just casually read it one time, like, the appendices. One casual read through the Lord of the Rings usually doesn't include that, so you probably need to have actually, been a fairly big fan of the book before catching these. So with that introduction, let's start part one of this, and after this, in the next video where I do part two, we'll have finally wrapped up this whole series. So the first one actually comes in the very first scene of the movie, where we get the discovery of the One Ring by Smeagol and Deagol. And the change here that you might not notice if you aren't, fairly familiar with the book is the fact that Smeagol and Deagol actually have a fight in this scene. In the original story, there's no mention by Gandalf of a fight. Now, of course, Gandalf doesn't know exactly what happened because he is inferring from what information he can get out of Gollum, and Gollum is probably lying about a lot of it, so he's having to parse through a lot of material. But the story that Gandalf tells Frodo is basically that Smeagol just takes Deagol by surprise and strangles him, and that's it. There is no fight. Whereas in the movie, we get this long, extended wrestling match, basically. And it's one of the things that I really don't like about the movie, because there's no indication that this would have happened in the original, and there's no reason we particularly need it either, because we don't... Well, let's put it this way. The Peter Jackson films give us every indication that once the ring is somehow in play, everybody violently goes for it, pretty much, except for some people who just inexplicably don't. And then the ring also completely controls your mind, except when it inexplicably doesn't. Like, Frodo will get totally out of his mind angry over the ring, but then when he's been tortured by orcs and is in Tirith and has basically no clothes on, is probably extremely uncomfortable and in pain, and Sam doesn't immediately hand him the ring, he's fine. So this is just another one of those examples where I could see why Peter Jackson did it, because he wants to make everybody just completely affected by the ring immediately as soon as it's even around, like Faramir. But also, he doesn't even follow his own rules, so I don't particularly like this change, but it is one that, if you only read The Lord of the Rings one time, when you were a teenager and you're, 40 years old when you watch the movie, then you probably don't remember this detail. So this next one is not exactly a subtle change in the sense that this scene doesn't happen at all, really, because Gimli and Legolas having a drinking game at Edoras does not happen. The subtle change, and this is this is really subtle. You have to really know your stuff to catch this one. The subtle change is exactly how Legolas should be responding to alcohol, and there are some writings by Tolkien that indicate that elves are less susceptible, say, to drunkenness than mortals, but they do actually get drunk. And there's also... So there's a lot of stuff on this. The main things to know, in The Hobbit, we do get a reference to the wine from Dorwinion, which is apparently supposed to be particularly strong, which is why it totally knocks out the guys in the cellar that Bilbo steals the rings from. I mean, not the rings, the keys, so that he can rescue Thorin and company. So we know that that wine is particularly strong, which is probably a subtle reference to the idea that elves don't just get plastered from, basic normal wine. And I think there may be something in Tolkien's letters or something that also comments on this, or maybe it's in The Nature of Middle-earth where he's really revamping the whole biology of elves. There are references here and there to this idea that you can kind of infer one direction or the other. But the real thing here to me is that Legolas should at least know what wine is. We don't really get a whole lot of references to this directly. We know from The Hobbit that the elves in Mirkwood drink wine, and they drink wine from Dorwinion, which, by the way, is Wineland. This is how Tolkien does names, guys. But the other thing is, we actually do get a reference in The Return of the King itself, which, by the way, this scene wouldn't have happened in The Return of the King. This would have been a Two Towers book scene, probably. But we get this one reference in the Two Towers where when Legolas, Aragorn, Gandalf, Theoden, all of them get to Isengard, and we have the scene which in the movie has Gimli, lusting after the salted pork. And Legolas, in the book version of the scene, says, "I would rather know how they came by the wine." So clearly Legolas knows about wine, and he likes it. So this scene in the Return of the King movie where he's like, "What is alcohol?" Now, I mean, arguably you could say he's just doing this because it's beer, not wine, and so he's like, "What is this?" But this is also the Legolas who knows every history of every culture everywhere, so how could he not know what beer is? Especially when we've already heard, a conversation between Gimli and Legolas in the Fellowship of the Ring where he says, "Now you will enjoy the fabled hospitality of the dwarves, roaring fires, malt beer, red meat off the bone." Like, Legolas knows what beer is, so it's just kind of like, it's not really clear why he's having such a hard time here. But if you didn't know your book backward and forward, you could imagine maybe that Legolas doesn't understand what alcohol is. But if you know your book fairly well, you know for sure that he knows and enjoys wine at a minimum. Here's another one that's subtle only in the sense that if you don't really understand the context, it's easy to kind of forget where it comes from in the book. And this is where Eowyn tells the dream of the wave, which, as major fans will know, is very much Faramir's dream. And it's a dream about Numenor. And it's a dream that Tolkien gave Faramir because Tolkien had the dream himself. All that as a backdrop, if you've only ever read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and you're not really familiar with the Second Age and Numenor and how it drowned and all of that stuff, the wave dream is just not something that is a huge blip on your radar, because it just seems like a weird thing that Faramir talks about with no particular relevance to anything. And so it's not necessarily easy to peg in the memory why it's important, and therefore it's a little harder to peg who says it and when. So it's subtle in that sense. And so when Eowyn talks about it in this scene in the movie, we can kind of see what Peter Jackson is doing with it, and it's the idea that there's just this impending doom that Eowyn is dreading. And Aragorn, basically says, it's going to be fine. He doesn't say that exactly. At least I assume that's what Peter Jackson is doing with this. I don't know what else he could be doing with this. I don't know why he gave Eowyn the dream if it wasn't for that, because otherwise it makes no sense to me. So I assume that's what he's doing here, and it kind of works in that way. And so unless you really know your stuff, it's not that obvious that the position of this dream changed in the story. I mean, it is in the sense that you'd probably recognize, I don't think she had that dream, but I don't remember who did. That kind of thing. So you'd have to know a fair bit, I think, for this to have been something that stuck out in your memory to know who actually dreamt it. This one is a matter of interpretation, because it's hard to say exactly the degree to which Gandalf's eyes should be open when Pippin goes to grab the Palantir. In the movie, they're pretty open. I would say at least half. In the book, it does reference the fact that Pippin sees the glint of eyes under his eyebrows, basically, and the impression I get from the book is that they're barely open. Open enough to tell that they are open, but not so wide open as the movie makes it look like, because it makes it seem like he's just catching like the hint of light reflecting off his eyeballs, whereas in the movie, I mean, if he wasn't snoring, you would assume he was awake, other than the fact that his eyes are kind of rolled up a little bit. So this is one where, yes, the idea is the same. Gandalf at first looks like he might be awake, and therefore Pippin is, ooh, I shouldn't. And then he realizes Gandalf is actually asleep. His eyes are just part open. But the subtle difference is partially a matter of interpretation, but I think it's relatively clear that he can't have his eyes open that much. So I'm sticking with my story. This next one is not, again, another one that's not exactly a subtle change, in the sense that this scene is not something that makes a minor change to something that happens in the book, but it's the scene where Theoden, is basically acting like he's not going to come to Gondor's aid, and he says, "What do we owe Gondor?" Well, what you owe Gondor is your allegiance, because you literally agreed to that. Not you personally, Theoden, but, the Rohirrim agreed to that when Cirion gave the land of Calanarthon to Eorl and the Rohirrim back in, 500 years ago. So, yeah, you kind of literally owe that. Now, if you didn't read the appendices, you certainly would not know that. At least you might have gotten some references to it, but you wouldn't have gotten the full story. And so it's not subtle in the sense that it's a radical departure, but it's subtle in the sense that you don't understand why what he's saying doesn't really make any sense from the book perspective unless you really know your material. And so in that sense, it's a subtle change that people aren't going to necessarily understand, that what he's doing is not just bad form, but legitimately what he's saying makes no actual sense from the perspective of, actually, you kind of owe them. Literally. So that's why I included it. There's another scene where Gandalf has, he basically tells Shadowfax, "Show us the meaning of haste." And this phrase is almost directly lifted from the book, but its position is a little bit different. And this is another one where, because of where it is in the original story, it's a little easier to miss. And that's because in the book, he's talking to Yorith, who is a rather chatty woman who works in the Houses of Healing. And Gandalf is saying, I will basically take her with me on Shadowfax, and we will go find Kingsfoil or Athelas, or, whatever you want to call it. And Shadowfax will show us the meaning of haste. So the line is, it's not in the imperative mood, it's slightly different, but the same phrase basically is there. And unless you're really solid with the story, this is one of those little subplots that's easy to forget, because it is a very minor subplot. Yoreth and the Houses of Healing and all that stuff is kind of like Tom Bombadil, except Tom Bombadil takes up 2-3 chapters. But it's one of those things that's a subplot that, the main story doesn't hinge on it at all. And so it's easy to kind of forget it if you're not really into the book and have read it multiple times. And so when you get to that line in the movie, you may be like, I remember that, but I don't remember where it came from. So, again, subtle in the sense that it's the same line, different context, and that context is not something that everybody who just casually read the book once would necessarily catch. This one is a purely visual thing, but it's the walls of Minas Tirith. In the movie, all of Minas Tirith is white. And if you only casually read the book, you might think that that was accurate, but it's not. In fact, the book tells us that the outer wall of Minas Tirith is black, and it's just like the black of Orthanc. You probably didn't even remember that yourself until I just mentioned it, but go look it up. It's seriously there. So, a lot of you might not have even noticed that, because when we see the big sweeping shots of Minas Tirith from a distance, we're all like, ooh, that's so cool. They made this giant miniature, and it looks awesome. And we tend to forget that he got that one detail wrong. This next one is one that I also find kind of annoying, but it's when Gandalf is opposed to Pippin taking the oath of service to Denethor and all that. In the book, Gandalf doesn't stop him and later will tell him generous deeds should not be checked by cold counsel, a line they give to Faramir in the movie. And if you know your book at all, you probably would catch this. But it's another one of those that if you read it only once and didn't really remember all the details of how everything goes down, you might know that Faramir didn't give that line, but you might not really remember how it all happened and in what sequence, and therefore not be inclined to think about it too much when you see it in the movie. So, it's subtle in that way because, again, it's like minor detail in one sense, and therefore you're not necessarily going to remember it. It's not going to stick out in your memory all that much unless you just really are a huge fan and probably read the book several times. This next one is very subtle, and it's one of those where the line is actually almost exact, and the person who says it is the same, but the meaning changes just a little bit because of the way it's done and in the context in which it's said. And this is where Denethor tells Gandalf, "For all your subtleties, you have not wisdom." In the book, the line is, "For all your subtleties, you have not all wisdom." And that is a very different kind of thing because in the movie, Denethor is just roundly mocking and insulting Gandalf, basically say, "You're subtle, but you're not wise." In the book, he's not saying that. He's basically saying, "You have wisdom, but not all wisdom. You still haven't, got everything." Now, in the movie, the context of this is not even about what it is about in the book, because in the book, it's actually it's in the context of a conversation about Boromir and whether he would have brought the ring back to Denethor. And Gandalf is basically saying, don't be upset that Boromir didn't, get the ring and that Boromir and Faramir hadn't switched places, because if Boromir had met them in Ithilien and he had taken the ring, which you're upset for Faramir for not doing, then he wouldn't, even in that case, have brought you the ring. He would have kept it. And this is where Denethor tells him, "For all your subtleties, you have not all wisdom. I know my son better than you do," is what he's saying. That is not at all the conversation that's happening when this line comes up in the movie, because they're not talking about that. They're talking about, Denethor is talking about, because Gandalf didn't bring it up, he's talking about, Gandalf trying to use Aragorn to supplant him and all this other stuff. So it's a completely different context. But even on its own terms, like I said, just leaving out the all subtly changes the meaning of that sentence from an outright insult to more of a slight dig of just saying, like, you aren't that smart. Here's another line swap, and this time it's from Faramir to Gandalf instead of the other way around. It's when Gandalf, after their audience with Denethor, is telling Pippin a little bit about the history of Minas Tirith in very broad, sweeping terms, which I don't know how useful that is, but all this stuff where he says things such as, they counted the names of their descent dearer than the names of their own sons. This is actually Faramir's lines to Frodo. And again, in the context of the movie, it works where it is. And in the book, it's one of those conversations that Faramir has with Frodo that's not directly impinging on the main action. It doesn't have anything really to do with advancing the plot. And so again, you might just kind of forget, like, who said that and when and where and why. And so, again, unless you really know it, you might not notice that this is in the wrong place and being said by the wrong person. Next, we get another line swap. There's a lot of these, because Peter Jackson likes to do that. Whenever the Rohirrim are about to set out from Dunharrow, Éomer gives this very short speech of, "Oaths ye have taken, now fulfill them all to Lord and land." And this line does occur in the book, but it actually is stated by Theoden when they're about to charge at Minas Tirith. And it's really interesting because Theoden's speech at that point is kind of an amalgamation he kind of mixes a couple things up in the movie at that point, and he doesn't do this part, which is what he's supposed to do, because he's basically like saying, you've taken oaths, now here's where you get to fulfill them. Whereas Éomer is saying it here as we're fulfilling it by setting out and eventually going to do the thing. So again, it kind of makes sense in its context either way, but who says it and when is different. And it's, again, not necessarily something that you're going to be able to pin down in your memory from one casual read. Next, we get another one that is mostly just a visual change, but it's not just visual in the sense that it's not, like just a color change of a wall. This is the scene where Gandalf rides out and scatters the Nazgul with light. So there's one change, the fact that Pippin is sitting on Gandalf's horse. That one's not so subtle. They only did that so that Faramir could actually see Pippin immediately after and be like, oh, you're not the first hobbit. So, Gandalf can have that moment where he's like, this is not the first halfling to have crossed your path. But the more subtle change is, in the book, the light comes from his hand, and in the movie, it comes from his staff. And the one is more impressive than the other, and somehow Peter Jackson decided to downgrade Gandalf, like he does whenever he has the Witch King just totally demolish him in like 3 seconds. I really don't like some of Peter Jackson's decisions, can you tell? So here we get the kind of continuation of the line swap between Gandalf and Faramir earlier, where Faramir, right before Faramir tells Pippin about, generous deeds should not be checked with cold counsel, this is the completion of that kind of change arc, if you will. But there's another point here that actually gets changed a little bit too, and this is because this is where Faramir, instead of Gandalf, tells Denethor that Boromir would not have brought you the ring. I mentioned this line earlier when I talked about the whole, for all your subtleties, you have not wisdom or all wisdom. This is the context in which that line should have been stated to Gandalf, who was the one who was supposed to say, Boromir would not have brought you the ring, but now it's Faramir saying that. And, it kind of works because Faramir is having his redemption arc of, I almost made that stupid mistake, and now I realize that, I almost really did something bad, and I know my brother well enough to know that he would have screwed up. So it kind of works in the movie the way they've set it up, even though I absolutely despise what they did to Faramir in this movie. But, again, it's one of those things that who says what in all the exchanges with Denethor and Faramir and Gandalf and Imrahil and all the other captains and all that. It's like, is it really that important of a detail for anybody to remember after one casual read? No. So are most people who do that going to remember exactly who said it and when? Probably not. Another subtle change has something to do with a situation in which a line is said, but the line is exact and the character is exact once again. And this time again, it's Denethor. Denethor says, much must be risked in war. And he is saying this in support of Faramir going back and trying to retake Osgiliath. The subtle change is that in the book, Osgiliath has not already fallen when Denethor says this. And when he says, I will not yield the city, the bridge in the Pelennor unfought, he's literally meaning that as I'm not going to let it go, because that's what yield means. In the movie, it's not a matter of yielding or not, it's a matter of retaking it. It hasn't been yielded exactly, it's just been taken, but there's no yielding or not yielding to be done. That decision is already made. It's, am I going to try to take it back? And that's a much more stupid decision, because now the enemy already has the fortified position from which they can easily defend against a stupid cavalry charge against an open plain. Whereas in the book, that's not really the case. And this is another one of those areas where Peter Jackson really downgraded a character, because Denethor's character in the book is so much better. Denethor is not just a spiteful, mean, stupid old man. He's a legitimately great leader in a lot of ways with just a serious character flaw. But in the movie, they just, they turn him into a complete idiot, because nobody would command a cavalry charge against a city, a broken down and deserted city, but a city with, actual buildings and things to hide behind nonetheless. So it makes Denethor look totally stupid. But again, unless you really pay attention to that conversation with the captains and understand the actual military situation at hand in the book, you're not necessarily going to catch that there's a change here. And I know when I was a kid and read this for the first time, I was a little less aware of exactly what the deal was, because the military tactics of it all was not the most important and interesting thing to me. And, that may not be the case for all readers, but it is going to be somewhat true that if you read this book once, casually, you're not necessarily going to remember that Osgiliath hadn't already been taken. You'll remember it was in play in some way, but that may be about it. Next, we get a scene with Frodo, Gollum, and Sam, and this, of course, is the one where Sam wakes up to find Gollum messing with the Limbas, and he accuses Gollum of sneaking, or sort of accuses him. And then Gollum, of course, takes umbrage and gets all, sneaking. But the subtle change is that in the book, this happens in the same place, and it's the same kind of conversation, mostly. I mean, it's almost word for word in a lot of places. It is word for word in some spots. But in the book, Gollum actually had been sneaking just before. He just got back from sneaking, and so the accusation from Sam actually hits a little harder, whereas in here, it's just feigned outrage. In the other one, you could imagine that Gollum is somewhat angry because he's feigning it, but also he probably is pricked a little because he actually did sneak off to basically go tell Shelob, I've just about got him here, get ready. So, yeah, the subtle change is Limbus had nothing to do with anything. It was actually Gollum sneaking off and coming back, and that's what Sam legitimately caught, not realizing exactly what it was. And he was unfair in his accusation, but that's only because he didn't know. This next one is, in a sense, not subtle at all, because it changes something that, from something that didn't happen in the book to something that did happen in the movie. It changes a lot of words, and it changes radically a context. But it is subtle in a sense, because a lot of these elements are, again, things that you're not necessarily going to remember perfectly if you read this book casually one time. And this is the scene where Pippin sings a song for Denethor. The song that he sings is, and is not, in the book. And by that I mean, it's actually kind of two songs. And they take words from two songs and put them together to give to Pippin for this scene. So the context is wrong, and the song that he sings is not actually a song from the book. And it's a very different style, too, because what he sings in the movie is actually from songs that are early on in their walking through the Shire, so that's songs that are singing to lift their spirits, so it's clearly not to be sung like a dirge, or whatever it is Pippin's doing. But the other point is, Pippin isn't actually supposed to sing for Denethor. The thing that we have in the book is that Denethor asks him, can he sing, but he, luckily, never actually has to sing for Denethor. We get that in the book. In the movie, he actually just asks him to sing straight up right then and there. Now we get to the scene where Elrond brings Anduril to Aragorn. And this actually makes me remember when Éomer earlier said, I should correct this now before I forget, when Éomer said, oaths ye have taken, that was not actually at Dunharrow. That was them leaving Edoras for Dunharrow. Messed that up. This scene is at Dunharrow, though, where Elrond brings Anduril to Aragorn, and he tells Aragorn in Elvish, I give hope to men. And then Aragorn finishes the line, I have kept none for myself. You wouldn't even know what this line was if you didn't read the appendices, so it's something that a casual book reader is not going to know. But the line is actually supposed to be spoken, the whole line, both parts, by Aragorn's mother. And Aragorn's mother, Gilraen, I think it's right before she dies. It's like the last time that she sees Aragorn. And she says it because Aragorn's name in his kind of pseudonym that he was given to hide his identity from the servants of the enemy was Estel, which in Elvish means hope. And so she's literally saying, I have given Estel, hope, to men, but I have kept none, hope, for myself. So it's kind of an interesting little thing there, but again, if you didn't read the appendices, you just wouldn't know this. This is one that I actually kind of already brought up in my details that Peter Jackson got right or whatever, but it's interesting because it's a subtle change in the sense of the right lines get spoken by the wrong elf. Well, you already know it's Legolas because there's only one elf in this business. Well, we did just have Elrond, but not him. In the book, when we get the whole thing about we need to take the paths of the dead, this comes about because Elrond's sons, Eladon and Elrohir, come along and tell Aragorn what Elrond told them to send as a message, and that is, remember the paths of the dead. And so when Legolas is reciting, some of this prophecy stuff, this is actually words spoken by Malbeth the Seer, who is actually not an elf. I shouldn't have said it was a wrong elf, wrong person, but it's kind of conveyed by elves in the book, so elves do speak it. It's just not the original words. Malbeth the Seer spoke about the prophecy of somebody going through the paths of the dead and, getting their allegiance or whatever. And so when Legolas does it in the movie, I mean, we're not introducing a whole subplot with Elrond's sons. I mean, it's understandable. And so again, it's, who exactly spoke it and in what context. It's another one of those little subplot things that, if you don't remember your book really well, you don't even necessarily remember the Grey Company exists. Halbarad and all the Rangers coming along with Elrond's sons and all this mess. Like, you probably don't even remember all that. And so Legolas saying the lines instead of somebody else, you're going to be like, I don't remember if he said it, but sure, why not? So, again, one of those things where you just wouldn't necessarily remember that detail. Speaking of the paths of the dead, this is one where there is a subtle change in the sense that it's directly opposite, so it's not subtle in the sense that the change is kind of a minor little tweak. It's actually radically opposite. But again, you wouldn't necessarily remember that unless you were kind of a careful reader or really read it multiple times. When Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli lose their horses at the door of the dead because their horses just run off, that is not what happens in the book. In the book, I don't remember who it was that said it. It might have been Halbarad, it might have been one of the sons of Elrond, but somebody said, the horses are not going to go in there. It's too terrifying. And Aragorn's like, yeah, well, we've got to have horses on the other side, so we're just going to have to make them. So that actually does happen in the book. They make their horses go through, and it makes it a little subtle because there is that element of the horses are terrified, and getting the horses to get through was a real challenge, apparently. But it is not something that actually happened in the book, that they just ran off or that they lost them. When they came through the paths of the dead, they actually had them and used them to good effect to make good time to get to the Corsairs, which of course Peter Jackson changes the entire geography so that when you come out of the paths of the dead, they're right there. That's not how that works in the book at all. Final scene for disc 1. This has been a longer video than I expected, but at any rate, final scene for disc 1 is when the Nazgul are terrifying the soldiers of Gondor, and in the movie, they're actually swooping down and knocking them off and tearing up trebuchets and doing all kinds of physical damage, basically. In the book, they don't do that. They just basically hover way up in the sky, out of sight a lot of the time even, just to increase the sense of dread on the ground so that all the people in Gondor are just constantly getting this sense of fear that just becomes oppressive. But they never come down and attack, and there's a reason for that. One reason is Sauron doesn't want, to risk the Nazgul getting shot out of the sky. I mean, for goodness sake, there can't be that many flying fell beasts that he can replace them with, so he can't afford to lose a ton of them. And he also doesn't want to risk the Nazgul. Their primary value is instilling fear, not in causing physical damage. He can do that with armies of orcs. He's got plenty. The orcs can all get killed, and he replaces one with 2 more. And I mean, like, why waste the Nazgul on something like that when you could just have the orcs do it? But what the Nazgul do, only they can do, and you want to save them for the really good stuff. So There's reasons why that doesn't happen in the book, but again, it's one of those things that if you didn't really remember the detail, because it's just kind of a passing thing that gets mentioned, the only time that, and you do get this reference in the Faramir chase when the Nazgul are chasing Faramir's men. This does happen. So there is a scene in the book where they are getting chased by the Nazgul, and that's when Gandalf, shines his the light out of his hand, and that would lead you to believe that they are more willing to get involved in direct combat. But when they're at the siege part of this, they're not attacking the men on the walls. That doesn't happen. But it's something that, from a movie perspective, you wouldn't understand that why they wouldn't. And if you didn't read the book recently enough or more than once, you might not remember that that's really not what they do. They just kind of sit up in the air and make everybody afraid. So that is disc 1 of The Return of the King for subtle changes that only major book fans would notice. One more video in this series, and then we'll be done with that. And then I've actually got a really good idea for another video that kind of is more my style, you might say, coming up after that. But probably won't get to that till after Christmas, because Christmas is coming up really fast, and I'm going to have another one of these videos, and then, yeah, so I'm not sure when that video will come out, but it's something to look forward to, I think, because it's much more my, deep dive analysis type style of videos. So if you're into that kind of stuff, keep an eye out for it. I think it's going to be a really interesting one. But if you liked this video, please do give it a thumbs up, share it around, make sure you subscribe to catch all my future content, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions every week, and check out the other support and social links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.